Hi, welcome to the tutorial on processing overhead for a joint venture. The objectives of this tutorial are to calculate the overhead costs of a joint venture, review overhead calculations, create overhead journal entries, and review overhead journal entries. On a monthly basis, you will calculate the overhead cost for the business units associated with the joint venture. You can only have one overhead entry for each month for the joint venture, business unit, rule, and method. When you calculate overhead, the system selects the methods from the rules you have assigned. It checks the effective dates of the methods and processes the methods that are effective for the calendar month. Let's see how to calculate the overhead cost for a joint venture in JD Edwards EnterpriseOne. Access the Calculate Overhead Batch program R09J408.
In the processing options for the program, specify whether the system should use the GL date or the service tax date to calculate overhead. The system selects transactions based on the date for data selection processing option and calculates overhead for the calendar month and the calendar year specified here. If you are calculating overhead for a specific business unit within a joint venture, you can specify that business unit in the business unit field.
In the data selection form, specify the joint ventures for which you want to calculate the overhead costs and then run the R09J408 program. When the program completes processing, the system generates a report that displays a success message if the overhead calculations are processed successfully. Review the report for errors or warnings, if any. After you calculate the overhead amounts, you can review and recalculate the overhead amounts before you create journal entries. Access the Review and Recalculate Overhead program P09J100. Use a saved query, the filter fields in the header, or the QBE fields in the grid to search for your calculated overhead records. If you determine that you have an error in your overhead setup, you have the ability to make the changes necessary to create accurate overhead amounts. To perform this action, you must first mark the overhead record you want to recalculate through the row menu. The system updates the status of that record to Available to Recalculate. Update the setup information as required and click Recalculate All from the form menu to process the recalculation. Let's now see how to create an overhead journal entry. Access the Create Overhead Journal Entries batch program R09J409. In the data selection form, specify the joint ventures for which you want to create the overhead journal entries. Then run the program. You can review the overhead journal entries by using the Review and Recalculate Overhead program P09J100. Search for your calculated overhead records on the Review and Recalculate Overhead form. Then select the record and select Overhead Journal Entry from the row menu to review the journal entries. To learn more about processing overhead, visit the task-based tutorial Processing Overhead in the learning path Creating and Managing Joint Ventures in JD Edwards EnterpriseOne. You can access the learning path from learnjde.com. Thanks for watching.